Thank you, Whitney, and good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Colby Duran. I'm the director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas. Thank you very much for joining us for this. We're very excited about the webinar that we have for you. We're going to be talking just a little quickly, just a quick overview about IFAI for some of the folks, just to kind of hear a little bit about what we do, but then we'll be jumping into kind of what we're calling this Cultivating Tribal Sovereignty, a call to action. So the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative is entering its 7th year and was started at the University of Arkansas School of Law by, at the time, Dean, now Vice Chancellor Stacy Leeds, and our founding director, Janie Sims-Hipp. We moved with Vice Chancellor Leeds to the Office of Economic Development in the University of Arkansas in July 2018. And we really think that fits with our mission. And our mission is to enhance health and wellness in tribal communities by advancing healthy food systems, diversified economic development, and cultural food traditions in Indian country. And we have a substantial number of projects in work and things that we've done over the years, and that we're building off of those to help provide some additional support for tribes, not only in building food systems long-term, but also in some of the immediate term and being able to help provide support for tribal governments, tribal producers, and tribal communities throughout the COVID-19 crisis and its lingering impacts. We try to talk about our work at the University of Arkansas's Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative by really saying that we're kind of putting the tribal sovereignty and food sovereignty. So all of the work that we do really helps provide strategic legal analysis, policy research, educational resources that focus on empowering Indian country food sovereignty, agriculture, and economic development. We have a very incredible team of 8 folks who are dedicated working with tribal governments and tribal producers and our partner tribal organizations across the country who are working on this, and we're very excited to be able to kind of talk about that. Our team, as you'll be hearing from some of them today, are here for you throughout this entire process. So do not hesitate to reach out to anyone on our team or myself to kind of talk about any issues or concerns, or if there's anything that we can do to be able to help with some of the different things that we have going on as well. So with that, I would like to kind of turn it over to our team and hand it over to our Director of Tribal Enterprise, Carly Hotbed. Carly, go ahead.
Great, thank you, Colby. That's a great introduction. Again, my name is Carly Hotbed. I am the Director of Tribal Enterprise here at Indigenous Food Initiative, or Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative, excuse me. We've been working very hard to provide supports for tribes as they've been navigating some of the challenges associated with the COVID-19 crisis, especially concerning food supply disruptions and production-related losses. So this webinar is essentially an overview and a call to action, encouraging tribes to step in and take action with regard to securing their own food sovereignty in support of their tribal sovereignty. This push is going to look at some of the challenges that we've seen through the COVID-19 crisis, how we can view those issues and how to frame them in order to think about what steps need to happen next. And then we'll talk about solutions regarding some of the opportunities that we see and have seen and have heard about from different tribes as how they're navigating to address some of those challenges before them. And we'll finish up with opportunities for the ways that Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative can help you and your tribe get in a space where there's an opportunity to develop local and regional food economies to help solidify the resiliency that's necessary for Indian country instead of being reliant on an external food system that has failed us, as we've seen recently. So we'll go ahead and hit the next slide. Colby talked about our founding, and we'll go ahead and move on from there. Again, we put the tribal sovereignty and food sovereignty. We're here to help and have some pretty set goals. Next slide. Like I said, this is a call to action, and it's important to remember that we are not truly sovereign unless we can feed our people. We cannot accomplish tribal sovereignty without food sovereignty. Tribal sovereignty is food sovereignty, and we need to keep that in the forefront of our minds as we're thinking about how we work through the issues that we see regarding food systems. Next slide. So we all know by reading the news, by being active in our tribal communities, that there's been an increased demand and strain on our food systems related to the COVID-19 crisis. But this crisis didn't break these systems. These were things that were already broken, that we were managing somehow to navigate, but it's been a revelation as we've seen the additional impacts. And we're seeing that through increased rates of people who are seeking nutrition assistance, like through SNAP or FDIPA programs. We're seeing those tribal food systems and supply chains that are disrupted. There's been a significant delay in federal aid that's impacted the ability of tribes to serve their populations. And there's also been some limited infrastructure that's further compounded COVID exposure and just had a cyclical effect as far as making these challenges more severe, whether it's access to housing, water, utilities, warehouse space, or especially transportation, considering how remote some of our tribal locations are and the transportation necessary to get food products there, especially if they're coming from off-res or outside of Indian country. Next slide. So when we're conceptualizing this, we want to make sure that we're going through a process and that we're not all willy-nilly and we have a really good game plan put together. So first, we're going to identify the needs and issues that are associated with your particular tribe. We're going to collect information, and then we're going to set goals based on that. Next slide. So we know that some of these tribally specific needs and issues surround, food deserts. Do we have enough tribal ag producers? Are our operations operating at the level or scale that are necessary to really meet the demands of Indian country from a local or regional perspective? How can we increase our market shares and bring more dollars back to the community and back to the producers in the area or operators? And then also deficient market access or undeveloped or underdeveloped markets. I'm producing this stuff, but where can I sell it? And then also we talked about that challenges of infrastructure and then also the unreliable supply chains. And there's going to be some overlap in some of these areas. The market access challenges will pair up with retail food space challenges. Lack of infrastructure can impact supply chain challenges. And then if you need more local producers, there may be challenges with getting that value add component. How can you make it more lucrative for somebody to get involved in production agriculture in the first place? So you want to consider what interventions are the best or most transformative for tribal governments to support moving forward. Next slide. So we've talked about needs and issues, and your tribes may be different from what I've listed. There may be some additional considerations, but this is going to be a general overview to get you thinking about the process. So the next step will be collecting information. We've heard and seen what's going on, but how do we know exactly where we're at? How can we get a good snapshot of that? First Nations Development Institute has a really good food sovereignty assessment tool that walks you through and helps you do an analysis and inventory of the state of your tribe. Where are we at? What do we have? What do we know? What kind of challenges or issues are coming up with that? So that's a great place to start. But you also want to look for employee feedback, community feedback, actual physical inventory, and then also hear from your elected officials. What are they hearing from their constituents that they represent? What specific challenges are being vocalized through that process? And then you also have data and audit report information. So what are your nutrition programs showing, social services, land management, et cetera? All of that information will inform your decision-making process and planning as you move forward. Next slide. So after talking about the issues and collecting the information, now we want to set goals. This is probably the most important component of deciding what to do and how to address food system challenges and food resiliency and sovereignty in Indian country. What do you want to do? What does your tribe want to do? You need to know your intended destination so you don't go off course. And I included this graphic of SMART goals because you need to keep in mind we want specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timed goals. And your goals could be, we want to feed our people. We want to provide a service directly to them. And we feel like that's an important component of our government to provide that service. Or we want to generate revenue. We have an ag production or an ag processing or some sort of operation that's going to return dollars to our tribe. And it's going to be helpful to expand that economy and put dollars in the tribe's pocket so we can then turn around and use those. Maybe you want to offset costs for other operations. You have an opportunity to vertically integrate, or you have some ideas about inputs that you can save costs on or make sure that you have a reliable supply. Occupying regulatory space is also an important component. We'll get into that later on in the slide in our slideshow. And putting land into production. And it doesn't even have to be production. You just need to make sure that your land is returning a value, and that value can mean preservation or conservation activities. That can be alternative use opportunities. That can be making sure that leases are set up appropriately, or even considering intergenerational planning. So those are kind of things to keep in mind as you go in mind. And if you have specific goals and stick to them, it's going to be a lot easier to game plan for what you want to do. Next slide. So if you want to feed people, that can look like expanding your nutrition programs or adopting nutrition programs, either from a federal program perspective or creating a tribal nutrition program yourself. Also, elder meals on-site or delivered, and we're seeing a lot more delivery opportunities with COVID challenges. You can offer foods through tribal programs. So your tribally run schools, daycares or Head Starts, health programs or community programs are good ways to get tribal foods to tribal peoples. And then there's also your market outlet opportunity, retail, farmers markets, cooperatives. There's a variety of ways to address the specific task of feeding people. Next slide. Generating revenue. This is a great opportunity for tribes that have the ability to do larger scale operations, whether that's revenue or size. If you have significant land resources, a good labor pool, ability to fund a startup that may operate at a loss at the beginning, you have to do an analysis of whether your tribe has the tolerance for that, and how long are you willing to prop up an operation before it hits that break-even mark. Looking at your operation manager and employee hires, those you need to be able to have consistency with that. What market are you going to sell to? Do you have any value add opportunities? So can you take over that next step in the food supply chain? So we grow this product, but maybe it needs to be processed a little bit further so we can return more value. How about understanding the regulatory components about specific types of production or operations? So things look a little different if you're growing, a row crop versus if you're growing hemp, or if you're targeting an organic market versus, conventionally grown product. So there's some things to consider there. Your ability to compete on the market at competitive price points. And then maybe it's easier, instead of starting in production, you start in processing. So those are some things to consider. And you need to make sure your scope is going to be sufficient to hit that break-even revenue. What resources are available? Is there going to be a need for additional investment? And identify your market, because if you build it, they might not come. There needs to be an endpoint and a game point of, if I have this product, where is it going? So there's a lot of things to consider when you're talking about an agribusiness enterprise, but it can be a good fit for your tribe. Next slide. Offsetting costs is also something to consider if you're facing challenges of sourcing, and you want to make sure you have a reliable source for a specific product or products that you're looking for. Quality or freshness issues or cost, especially if there's a lot of volatility in that, you can kind of secure your own source and know that it's going to be reliable and available to you. Maybe there's a specific demand for specialty products, or you have a surplus left over from production after you've already provided that through a service program. So, hey, we have a bunch of produce that we distributed through a tribal nutrition program, but we have some left over. Should we sell it? Should we use it for, other types of opportunities? And then if there's a tourism component, and I'm thinking about that from, a display for visitors and kind of that agritourism thing that has been pretty attractive. And if you have seasonal markets, so if you see a lot more activity in the summer, but you think it's important to have permanency of jobs associated with that operation, what are you going to have people doing in the winter? And it may be worth it, even though if an agribusiness operation may not be self-sustaining, but if it's important for a tribe to make sure that there are good jobs available and services provided associated with that, it may be worth it to consider that vertical integration instead of outsourcing or finding that. If you also have land use limitations, there's some additional considerations that you can bring for that. If your goal is self-regulation and preservation of tribal sovereignty, like it should be for every tribe, we have some really good opportunities available. Tribes set the rules, and you have the ability to create a code and put regulations in place that prevent encroachment on tribal sovereignty, that occupies that regulatory space, and sets the policies and preferences specific to your tribe's needs and your tribe's demands. So some of those policies could include production activities, land management, conservation, food safety and handling, field safety, humane handling for livestock. There's a lot of different areas that can be regulated from a tribal perspective to prevent encroachment, and we'll talk about that later on. Next slide. So we just visited about that one. Next slide. So we talked about goals. What are the solutions? So we know that we want to get busy and step in, and we have a goal of feeding people, or we have a goal of a business enterprise. What's the next step? So we've compiled suggestions for ways to make systemic changes for tribes to support food sovereignty. And everything that we talk about, IFAI is able to help in the planning and implementation of all parts of things that we're going to talk about today. So keep that in mind, and if you have additional questions, get with us. I'm going to rip through this information because this is intended to be an overview and give you some ideas about what areas that you want to get busy to work in and how we can help you. Next slide. The house where food sovereignty lives is your tribal Department of Agriculture. Consider what organizational structure would be the best fit for your tribe's needs. When we're talking about departments of agriculture, there's a lot of benefits that come along with having a specific organizational structure to handle a lot of the programmatic activities that we see in agriculture and in food systems. So make sure that you're considering what kind of staff do you need. Professional staff and development is important. Do you have opportunities for youth? Can you share staff if maybe you have a startup program and you have a neighbor tribe or partner entity that can maybe split an employee with you to get things going until you have a more robust opportunity. Tribal departments of agriculture allow tribes to retain that institutional knowledge and kind of have like a depository for where all of that information lives. It operates as a very findable organization for federal grant funds or outside funders. There's a way to structure the oversight of programmatic activities, 638 self-administration opportunities, and just generally being a point of contact, which I know when we work in Indian country, if we have turnover or sometimes information is not as robustly published or shared for various reasons, knowing at least what number to call or what office you're looking for can be helpful to share information. Next slide. This is an example of a Department of Ag organizational chart. So these are the different programs that can live under Department of Agriculture, and every tribe is going to structure them differently depending on what their preferences are. So if there's a business enterprise that can live under Department of Ag, food nutrition programs, extension opportunities, youth programs, ARMP or land management, this is a really exciting opportunity. We're going to talk about ARMPs a little bit later. But you can see where all these programs kind of live under there and how you can organize it. This is a very simplified chart. Most tribes are not going to have everything as neat and clean as this type, and I'm going to show you at next slide. So this is a tribe's Department of Agriculture kind of example. You'll see this highlighted red space. That's the Division of Ag and Natural Resources housed under the Department of Interior, which is under the Executive Office, which is under the big umbrella of tribal government. The programs that I've listed here, these are not comprehensive for this tribe. These are just indicative of what programs touch or could be organized under a Department of Ag. So we see like tribal land management, wildlife, agribusiness, and ag youth are actually housed under the division. But these nutrition programs, especially when we're talking about 638 sourcing authority coming down the road, that may be an opportunity to collaborate with ag or natural or with the Department of Agriculture. Game warden for wildlife activities, CDFI for credit opportunities, planning and grants for capital resource opportunities or funding. And then labor and staffing. I point this out because labor costs are something to consider, especially if you're operating an agribusiness operation with a revenue generating goal. A lot of times full-time staff with tribes have high benefit and indirect cost ratios that increase the costs associated with that labor cost for the overall budget. In this instance, the division of Ag uses a tribally held business enterprise labor and staffing program to find employees to work on the agribusiness enterprises at a reduced cost. So the staff are paid hourly and they still get benefits, but it's not quite as high of a percentage add-on compared to a full-time tribal staffer. So that's just something to think about. Next slide. So the regulatory departments of agriculture can also promote resource allocation. Like we said, it can establish that network of food growers, be a centralized point of contact if there's a third party that's looking to get information, and it sets up like a single conduit of communication for disaster response. So if there may be some challenges in locating the right person to talk to, say if you have somebody who wants to donate some food resources, and they can't find that person, they know, hey, agriculture is food, maybe we can call them and get something figured out. And it also encourages individual producers or other entities that are involved in ag to plan for emergencies themselves, either through individual plans or through folding in those partners in a larger scale emergency management plan from a tribal government perspective, knowing what the Department of Ag is and has as inventory, but also that broader food system that exists within your tribal jurisdictional area or even immediately adjacent to it. So it just kind of helps conceptualize and understand where your tribe is at and the resources available to it that need to be considered when you're dealing with emergencies. Next slide. Tribal departments of agriculture can also help with that self-actualization and food sovereignty. And what that means is I think that tribal departments of ag kind of touch on every single level of Maslow's hierarchy, which is the pyramid that you see on this slide. And it's a centralized resource that provides the technical assistance, direct services, and helps build connections with those external partners. So physiological needs, food, water, shelter. Food primarily is kind of a no-brainer when it comes to meeting that physiological need. Safety and security, how do we respond to emergencies, and how do tribal citizens find employment or resources? The Department of Ag can step in and help with that. Belonging, how can tribal citizens buy into solutions, and how does the government engage its citizens? Departments of Agriculture, as the point of contact and resource, may have better information about knowledgeable shareholders and how to get that information to them and hear feedback from them. Relationship building, how do you leverage the resources and build partnerships? Like I said, being that point of contact for either third-party resources or liaising with the federal government or state government or nonprofits or your tribal community as a whole really helps solidify the networking necessary to have a successful operation or service providing entity. And then self-actualizing, how does tribal government regulate these interactions? So you build all the way up to that, and this is, are we being fair? What are the rules? How can we play fairly within the rules, and make sure you're not unduly burdening or giving anybody a harder or easier time than somebody else without justification for that, or having an imbalance where there shouldn't be one. So there's some really good concepts that are included in there when you look at it through the lens of the Department of Agriculture. Next slide. You can also be a receptacle of data and information as a Department of Ag. So the 2017 Census of Agriculture, that the Census of Ag occurs every 5 years, and NASS, the National Ag Statistics Service, collects that confidential agricultural operation data. They report on an aggregate basis, so any sort of personal information or specific information to an operation isn't shared or published like that. But this would be a way for your Department of Ag to be the go-to to say, hey, NASA's doing the data collection, what information do you have, et cetera, et cetera. Additionally, on the single port of contact, like I said, public and private resources, how can we facilitate market opportunities, and then promoting employment opportunities in the tribal, federal, and private sector. So a lot of times, the programs that are knowledgeable about that subject matter will have better information about what's coming down the pipe, and help get that information out to your tribal community and your tribal citizens to let them know about opportunities that they can have to either get a job, work in a specific area, access a market, or get assistance to scale up their operation, whatever it is. If you have the inherent knowledge of what to expect, you can share that information a lot better, and the Department of Agriculture facilitates that. Next slide. Staffing is incredibly important. When you're looking at your Department of Agriculture, you need to make sure that you have people in there who are leaders with vision and execution. You can have the highest and biggest hopes and dreams, but if you don't have a process set up and somebody that knows how to get the job done, you're gonna have a hard time being successful with that. Getting people who meet the job descriptions necessary to get the job done helps develop that internal expertise and build that institutional knowledge. And you also need to think about, how are you developing the future of agriculture? Are you giving young graduates an opportunity either through externships or fellowship placements? You need to staff to your program goals. Make sure that the people that you're bringing on are going to be able to execute the goals that are set up. You also can train your current staff on desired skills if maybe they're covering most of the bases, but you think that there's some additional opportunities available to really maximize that person's work opportunity. Please do that. And then also sharing that professional staff with partners is something, because we know a lot of times if you're going to bring on a professional, somebody with higher education, especially if they have an advanced degree that's going to be doing specific work for you, that can be a pretty big cost burden to attract the right kind of person that you're looking for. So considering job splits with other entities may be something to consider. Next slide. All right, Department of Ag funding. This is, show me the money, right? Where can we get some dollars to get our ag enterprises going and really scale up or make our food systems more robust? So there's, on the 2018 Farm Bill, there are a lot of funding opportunities available for tribes and individual tribal producers through rural development grants, conservation programs, infrastructure supports, and then also environmental assets. But there's also opportunities for external funding through private grant makers like NAF or First Nations Development Institute, and also look at credit opportunities and even capital donations and gifts. So I've heard of movements where tribes or other organizations will cover the estate planning costs so that you can get a will or a trust set up, and in exchange for a percentage of the estate after it's probated, or even giving an opportunity for tribal or non-tribal people to leave property on or off the reservation area specifically to the tribe if it's held in fee status. And I know that other tribes have benefited from people leaving that land to the tribe in their will. So there's some, free land. Who doesn't want that? Let's get it back. But there's a lot of different ways that you can consider funding opportunities that can be filtered through the Department of Agriculture. Next slide. Something that's really exciting is the 638 authority at the USDA, which is going to encourage economic development and these food security opportunities. So this 638 self-governance authority, this is happening for the first time for the FDIPR program. It's in the pilot, but the idea is that it's going to enable tribal nations and ITOs to enter into self-determination contracts and source food for FDIPR food packages. And the opportunity to promote tribal sovereignty through food and help supports local tribal producers as well. So if you have local tribal producers that says, hey, I have something that meets this food package, do you want it? And it allows the tribe to source directly from your local producers. So you create a market through that 638 opportunity for your local producers to be able to enter and get some return for their product. So anytime that you can use tribal opportunities to support your local tribal producers is incredibly valuable. There's $3 million that have been appropriated for the demonstration project, which is available until fiscal year 21. And USDA is still working on opening the application process for this. So as soon as we get info for that, we will definitely share it with you. Next slide. So I talked about entering the regulatory space, and our support for that is featured here as the Model Tribal Food and Agriculture Code, and you can visit that at tribalfoodcode.com. There is a login. We want to protect that information and make sure that any proprietary tribal code is protected. So that's why we're required to log in. But these are the topics that cover, anything from health and nutrition, aquaculture, water, conservation activities, liability. They're all included in there, and it's intended to be tailored to the individual tribe's needs. And we use examples from existing tribal codes to inform the creation of this model code. Next slide. That model tribal food code is really important to consider if your goal is promoting and preserving tribal sovereignty. When you adopt that food and ag code, you as a tribe set your own standards and preferences when it comes to regulation and rulemaking. It prevents encroachment on tribal sovereignty by external governments or other entities, and it assures that tribal priorities are upheld, that your cultural standards control, and tribes are empowered in that decision-making and self-determination. Next slide. One of the ways that we see some influence in that regulatory space is through that Food Safety Modernization Act. There's a push for food safety regulation on the farm, and tribal nations can occupy that space for their jurisdiction. With the adoption of a model code or a targeted code that is based off of the model code, we see that, we know that tribal nations have been involved in food safety since time immemorial, and the positions that tribal nations can get through adoption of this model tribal food code are the most appropriate to shape those food systems on tribal lands, and that includes tribal safety. We know that tribal nations and American Indian and Alaska Native producers are already engaging in international trade, and this code offers a harmonized approach to food safety modernization so that these producers can have clarity and easily access available markets. The compliance with food safety regulations is vital to be entering certain markets, domestic and international. So making sure that you have verification that your farm or your operation is following food safety regulation requirements is important. And if you maintain the tribal laws and those regulations on food sovereignty, especially around Food Safety and Modernization Act, it sends messages to other regulators that your tribe is occupying the space and these tribal laws should apply, and they are controlling. And through a Department of Agriculture, tribes can inspect and regulate the food products and food businesses on tribal lands. So this is USDA. We don't need your help on this. We have it covered. We have a very robust inspection and compliance system. We meet all of these specific market preferences that are necessary to enter and take these products to the market, and it allows tribes the sovereignty and autonomy to make sure that they're developing food systems and encouraging production in a manner that's going to be very marketable. Next slide. Some other ways that tribes can support through other ways that tribal departments of agriculture can benefit tribes is through supporting a food hub or cooperative. Some of those ways might include the tribe gets a USDA vendor contract and picks up local tribal producers as subcontractors to meet the volume demands. So there's some instance there. With the model tribal food code regulations that are in place, like on the slide we just talked about, those subcontractors meet the tribal safety requirements versus some of the more onerous USDA mandates based on that. And then you also promote local and regional sourcing from tribal producers. So in the graphic, you have producers that are your farmers, your ranchers, your harvesters. They meet up at the food hub, and the food hub either consolidates warehouses, maybe processes or packages, maybe does the record keeping or financials, and then accesses the market, which alleviates some of the burden or responsibility from those producers. And that could be retail, restaurants, it could be direct to consumers. There could be that market could just be like one step up the supply chain. So maybe they do further processing or further packaging. But the thing that this graphic doesn't show is that the food hub also works in the opposite direction by recruiting producers and encouraging, hey, we have an interest in this. Can you produce this type of product to meet the demand that we're seeking to fill? And it also helps spread risk when we're looking at, if you're an individual producer and you're looking to access a market and you have a finite amount of product, maybe you can't demand the same type of price for that. And if you're able to consolidate your resources through a food hub, there's some opportunities there. Next slide. Value-added opportunities are something that a tribe can step in and provide some support for. Processing and packaging, branding or labeling, product enrichment, vertical integration, or operation diversification are things to push. This is interesting to me, especially when we're talking about hemp opportunities, and this could be applicable to other types of crops as well. But a lot of times the processing or harvest equipment is a lot more expensive for some of the land base that's available for tribal producers. You can't justify, $250,000 combine if you're only operating on 60 acres. So instead of having to purchase that equipment, a tribe can step in, purchase the processing or harvest equipment, put together a cooperative and say, hey, tribal producers, you bring your stuff here, we'll process it for you at a discount or competitive rate, but prevent you having to travel further or have additional burdens associated with accessing, processing, or harvesting opportunities. So there's just some ideas there, and I'm happy to talk to anybody or any tribe that's interested in looking at opportunities to help their local producers offset some of their value-added costs. Next slide. Okay, so we talked about IARMA. What is IARMA? It is the American Indian Agricultural Resource Management Act of 1993. I'm going to be very cursory over these two slides because we did do a whole presentation specifically over IARMA and ag resource management plans under this act. I encourage you to check that out. It's on our website at indigenousfoodandag.com. And it's very in-depth, but this is a fantastic tool that's available for tribes to develop their own ag resource management plan, and again, occupy regulatory space and set preferences and priorities for agricultural activities, land management activities that, once that plan's in place, the BIA has to comply with. So tribally set policy is mandatory, and only if there is a conflict with the United States Constitution or other specific federal laws will the feds be allowed to deviate or oppose any component of that. So this is an opportunity to say, this is what we want, this is how we're going to make it happen. So you can check that out on our website later on. IARMA has some specific goals. It acts as an inventory. It establishes goals and objectives, defines what's important to the tribe and its members, and how to consider those when making plans, what actions need to be taken to meet those objectives, and getting that buy-in from public meetings with shareholders and stakeholders. And as you're working through the planning process, that the public meeting notes, all the data, all the information that's generated and available specific to the goals in the land base and the operations of that tribe are made available in order to consider how that ARMP needs to be developed. And you have a 3-year timeline on it. But again, check out that website, or excuse me, check out that presentation that we did. It's available on our website, and it is much more in depth, but it's a great tool, and I'm really excited to see some progress in that realm. Next slide. So you don't have to start from scratch. You can take a look at what existing resources you have and build out from there. What facilities do you have? Are there regular gatherings or events that maybe a tribe will want to capitalize on or use as an opportunity to get information out, or have some additional activity? Maybe there's some like swap meets, and you maybe think that there's some space to set up a farmer's market to access the commerce that's associated with that. Maybe you have really good information technology and you can do some marketing through a website or through an online platform. What production facilities do you have available? What's your land base? Do you have some stellar staff that have some great ideas and you want to empower them to help meet those goals? And what knowledge exists? And we know our Indigenous knowledge gives really great insight as far as ecological, phenological, and seasonal knowledge, and how that can tie into our local and regional food economies and maximize the opportunities associated with production and processing activities. It also keeps in mind what kind of conservation needs are appropriate and how to regulate harvest. So there's just a dearth of opportunity available with what existing resources you have, whether it's capital, whether it's people, whether it's ideas, or whether it's other types of resources. Next slide. And we always want to consider the future of agriculture. How are we supporting the pipeline and the development of people as they're coming through, whether they're brand new to agriculture or whether they come from a farming family, or maybe they want to change gears and produce something different or have a different type of value add or diversification. So youth programs are definitely encouraged, and that can look like developing curriculum, having internships, sponsoring livestock acquisitions, sponsoring contests or travel, FFA and 4-H support. If you have great FFA or 4-H programs that are inclusive for your tribal kiddos, there's ways that you can make it easier for them to participate. I love a good all Indian livestock show, and I think those are fantastic. It gives a really good opportunity to recognize the hard work that young people put in when it comes to their show animals, and it's always exciting and a fun thing to go to. And then you as a tribe can also host competitions, whether it's the livestock shows or a speech contest or other types of agricultural activities. Maybe you want to do a tractor pull. I don't know, that's an option, but those are all really great ways to encourage your youth to become involved in agriculture. For individual producer development, there's also some great opportunities to help those individual producers maximize their opportunities through training, whether it's basic record keeping or safety certifications, putting them in contact with resources for land leasing or acquisition, extension opportunities like training, being a point of contact, having on-site assistance for targeted issues, sharing information, compliance assistance. That access to credit component is incredibly important for the success of individual producers. And then also that generational planning. How are you going to ensure that your land doesn't fall out of trust or restricted status? How are you going to ensure that that this parcel, if it's an allotted parcel, doesn't become subjected to highly fractionated land interest, and preserving the solidarity of the land that's available. Next slide. So how can we help you? How can we get you to where you want to be? Or how can we even, kind of help you game plan? You may be somewhere at the beginning, middle, or towards the end of the process. We have resources available to you to help get you where you want to be. Planning and conceptualizing what you want to do, helping you set goals and really identify what's important to your tribe and how you can move forward for that. What funding opportunities exist. We can especially provide you with legislative support for tribal codes to develop that, and then also the education and advocacy component that comes along with it. How do you want to structure your organization? We can help you with that. And the great news is I kind of we want to be your nerds. Let us help you. We are staffed with attorneys. We have people on staff with federal experience, with tribal experience, with food and ag program experience, and we all do policy information and research work. So we have the tools available to get you where you want to be, whether it's you want to scale up your agribusiness enterprise, you want to explore 638 opportunities for self-sourcing and self-administration. You want to really focus on providing a service to your people. We can structure it specifically for you. Next slide. But we also want to hear from you. You can help us better inform the work that we do and help us continue in the progress that we make and provide to Indian country with regard to food and ag policy and education opportunities through shareholders and stakeholders. But your stories and your input and your operations are incredibly important to us. We would love it if you would be interested in becoming an advisory board member. We have a couple of opportunities to staff those. Please reach out if you're interested, or if you want to recommend somebody to sit on an advisory board, we'd like to hear from that as well. We also want to hear about your program successes. Have you started a food hub or cooperative and it's going really well, and you think that you want to share that information? Have you already developed a Department of Ag and you're seeing a big change and a big difference in how your local and regional food economies are working, or even how resources are being allocated based on that? Is your staff killing it? Are they knocking it out of the park and doing a lot of really great work and helping you get your tribe where it needs to go? And we also want to encourage youth to attend that youth summit. It's hosted virtually this year by nature of our social distancing requirements per the pandemic, but we have some really great tracks available. And we also want to hear from you. Tell us what you're doing. What are your successes? What are your challenges? What knowledge have you gained as you've been learning more and working and collaborating in the field of tribal agriculture? It's incredibly important to us to hear that feedback and hear from you directly, because it informs the work that we do very much. Next slide. So that wraps up the presentation. Again, I'm Carly Hotvet, Director of Tribal Enterprise, and we're here to help you. We want to help tribes get to that next level and really shore up the resiliency that's needed in Indian country to establish food sovereignty and then therefore tribal sovereignty. So my email's there, hotvet@uark.edu, and then the websites are below. And also remember to check out the Model Tribal Food Code website, which is in the earlier slides, and this will be posted on our website. But thank you so much for joining me today, and I'm going to turn it back over to Whitney.
Thank you so much, Carly. We really